Growing up, it seemed to me that most people believed that stories do not belong in games. That games were not about delivering a variety of emotions and ideas, but were about beating up the bad guys or making tricky jumps. Any sign of a story was just a distraction from what the game truly is, especially those annoying cutscenes in between spurts of gameplay. Nowadays, I doubt that's what the majority of people think, given story-driven games like The Last of Us or Life is Strange have become extremely popular, and even snag a Game of the Year award here or there. But even so, whenever I listen to or partake in discussions over what's new in the world of video games, there's one idea I occasionally see that bothers me. Story comes second. Story is never the primary focus of a game, and story should be considered after gameplay, not in parallel. I believe this is a poor design philosophy, not only because the relationship between gameplay and story can be very nuanced and complex, but also because story is not something games can just ignore. All games need stories. I'm Professor Chronic, and this is my show, GamerLogue. Now, don't take that the wrong way. Different games try to accomplish different things. So, Kirby games, which are supposed to be simple and playful, have no business trying to be as cutscene heavy as Uncharted. However, it's important to understand that the word story is more encompassing than we make it out to be. When we throw the word story around, what we often mean is plot, which is, of course, the sequence of major events in a narrative. However, while plot is integral to what makes stories, they're also made of characters, settings, and tones. They're made of Marios and Bowsers, of the vast kingdoms of Hyrule and Skyrim, and even the serene atmosphere of Satoral Marsh. And these things are important because they complement other elements of the game, including visuals, sounds, and, yes, even gameplay. For instance, stories give context to game mechanics to make them feel like a part of the game's world, and make them easier to understand. In Xenoblade Chronicles, Shulk has the power to see into the future, thanks to her sword, the Monado. And while the mysteries of the Monado are a driving force in the game's narrative, it's also something that's woven into the battle system. Because of Shulk's power, players will see visions of what the enemy will do next, and how much damage that will do. Then they are given the chance to counterattack. And while this is a mechanic that could be implemented independent of any kind of story, knowing about Shulk and what he can do makes it easier to understand what these visions are supposed to be and how they work. Plus, being able to interact with the world using a mysterious power is inherently more interesting than being able to do a thing just because, well, the developer said so. Stories also add to games by making you attach to the characters and what they have at stake, and then using that to make the experience more memorable. So, in Pokemon Red and Blue, or Leaf Green if you're playing the remakes and have good taste in starter Pokemon, the battle against the champion is a very climactic moment. A lot of that has to do with the fact that, well, it's the climax. It's the point in the game the player has been working towards the entire time, and the most challenging battle they've had so far. But it's also a battle against Blue, or Gary Oak, or Buttface, or whatever you decided to call this guy. Because this guy is a jerk. He's stuck up, he's annoying, and you're like nothing more than to put him in his place. The game could have given you a faceless opponent, but instead decided to give you an opponent you wanted to punch in the face, adding emotional investment to an already important battle. So, stories aren't just about adding plot for the sake of plot. They enhance everything that makes the game what it is. But a game without a story is lifeless. It is dull, and it is boring, which I'm pretty sure is the last thing anyone wants their game to be. A game stripped down to nothing but its basic mechanics is often nothing but a gray block navigating a monochrome scene. It's functional, but lacks interesting characters and environments. Taking away the story from something like Splatoon wouldn't just mean taking away the single-player campaign or the Sunken Scrolls, it would also mean to strip the game of its graffiti aesthetics. The Squid Sisters, kids who turn into squids, and staying fresh until you're left with nothing but that blob of a tech demo Nintendo always mentions whenever they talk about the game's development. None of that is to say a game can't be fun without a story. If a mechanic is good enough, it's capable of entertaining the player on its own. Just look at Tetris. It doesn't have any characters or setting to speak of, it's just blocks falling onto more blocks. And yet, it's one of the best selling games of all time. Its simplicity makes it fun and gives it an almost universal appeal. But here's the thing. A game without a story is a game without meaning. And it's a game without imagination. If you don't have any elements of a story, you're gonna fail to make a lasting impression on your audience. Just look at literally any other successful franchise in the industry. The original Tetris might be one of the most popular titles of all time sales-wise, but people don't get hyped about the latest version of the game the same way they do about something like God of War. And forgive me if this is you, but I've never met anyone who absolutely adores Tetris the same way as you would Earthbound or Ocarina of Time. I respect Tetris for being a nifty little game and for being plain fun, but Tetris doesn't resonate with players because there's nothing to resonate with. It might be a good game, but its lack of story prevents it from being a great game. Heck, I think that's something the developers in charge of Tetris understand because, hey look, that latest Tetris game had characters. Just to be clear, the necessity of story does not excuse the poor execution of story, such as intrusive cutscenes that overstay their welcome or trying to deliver a dark, serious story without understanding what makes a story either of those things. None of that is good, Vector. That's why it's called war. But stories are what establish a game's identity. They create the world that we run around in and give us goals and context that work in tandem with the game's mechanics. They create characters for us to play as and to interact with. And along with music and visuals, they create the tone and atmosphere of the game. Almost everything that we think about when it comes to our favorite game is either thanks to or enhanced by that game's story. And they also tend to be responsible for what we discuss when we talk about these games. Whether it's our princess is in another castle, playground rumors of some kind of blue Pikachu, or Kingdom Hearts being way too complicated for its own good, the things we talk about the most are usually some elements of the game's story. So much of gaming culture, urban myths, and yes, even memes, tend to at least relate to the game's characters and plot. Like, I never really looked too much into what the new God of War is like, or any God of War for that matter. But even I can tell you that the latest entry should be called Dad of War, and Kratos doesn't know how to say anything other than boy. And I know that because that's what resonated with players, and that's what they talk about. So, when I hear someone say story comes second, I can't help but think that's an unhealthy way of creating a game. That's not to say a game's mechanics aren't important because, what, are you kidding me? Of course they're important. They're what make a game to begin with. But stories are what give games their appeal. They add to what the game is trying to accomplish, and they allow the game to have a lasting impact when they would otherwise be a pile of grey mush. So, I think we shouldn't ask ourselves, do we prioritize story over the game mechanics, any more than we do with the game's art style or soundtrack? Rather, we should ask ourselves, how can I make the story mechanics complement each other in order to make the game the best it can be? Thanks so much for watching. GamerLogue is a series I plan on making on the site to express my thoughts and findings on what games and stories can be. If that sounds interesting to you, then subscribe to my channel so you can catch future videos. You can also follow me on Twitter, if that's your sort of thing. Regardless, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great day.